I was 18 years old the morning they handed me a garbage bag full of my own clothes and called it a fresh start. 18 years old, $60 folded into a manila envelope, and a caseworker's handshake that lasted about as long as it took her to let go of my hand. I want to tell you something before I tell you the rest of it. There were things about that land my family never told me, things buried so deep in the county records, so deep down in the soil itself, that even the people who tried to bury them couldn't quite finish the job. I didn't know any of it when I walked out of that children's home into a cold March morning with everything I owned in a plastic sack. I didn't know it when I spent my first winter in a rented room above a feed store, working double shifts just to keep the lights from going dark. And I didn't know it when I watched my grandfather's farm, the only place that ever once felt like home to me, get carved up and sold off to strangers who had never in their lives touched that soil. I didn't know it then, but the land knew. The land kept the secret. And the land, as it turns out, is more patient than any of us will ever be. If you've ever been counted out before you were ever counted in, stay with me tonight, because this story is for you. My grandfather's name was Silas Crane. He was not a tall man, not a loud man, not the kind of man who walked into a room and made everybody turn their heads to look at him. He was the other kind, the kind who got up before the sun came up because the cows didn't know it was Sunday, because frost doesn't wait for a convenient hour, because the work was the work and it needed doing and there was no use complaining about it. He had rough hands, a quiet voice, and when he did speak, he measured out every single word like he was spending something he could never earn back. I called him Pop Silas. Everybody else just called him Silas. The county called him stubborn the year he fought the road survey and wouldn't sign their easement. The bank called him a poor risk the year he refused to put the South Acres up against a loan. His own two sons called him difficult, mostly behind his back. I called him the only real home I ever had in this world. My mother was his youngest. Her name was Della. She was a girl who never quite fit anywhere she landed, too restless for the farm, too soft for the city, too proud to ever ask for help until the help was already long gone. She left Cedar Hollow when I was 4 years old. She came back twice. The second time, she didn't leave on her own 2 feet. I was 7. I stood out in the gravel driveway in front of Pop Silas's farmhouse in my socks, and I watched 2 men load my mother into the back of an ambulance. And I understood in that wordless way that small children understand the most terrible things, that she was not coming back to me. She didn't. I stayed, not because anybody sat down and decided that I should, not because there was a plan or a lawyer or a single piece of paper drawn up in those early days. I stayed because Pop Silas didn't send me anywhere. He just set a place at the table. He put an extra wool blanket on the bed in the little room off the kitchen, the one that smelled like cedar and old plaster. And the next morning, before the light was even up, he stood in the doorway of that little room and he said 6 words to me. Today, he said, you learn to feed chickens. That was how it started. I want you to picture this land because the land is the heart of everything I'm about to tell you. The Crane farm sat out on the eastern edge of Broward County, Kentucky, hill country, ridge country, the kind of land that asks something of a person before it ever gives a single thing back. 70 acres in all, 30 acres of bottomland down near the creek where the corn came in tall and good in the years the weather decided to cooperate. 20 acres of pasture on the lower ridge where the cattle grazed, and another 20 acres of woods and rough, broken ground that climbed on up toward the ridgeline, like the land itself was trying to reach up and touch the sky. It was not rich land. Nobody who knew anything would ever have called it rich. But it was deep land with a long memory packed down into it. Pop Silas had worked that ground for 40 years by the time I came to live there with him, and he knew it the way you only ever come to know a thing you have earned slowly with your own 2 hands over a long stretch of years. He knew the wet corner of the south field that always needed draining. He knew the shelf of limestone that ran underneath the pasture and bent every fence post you tried to drive down into it. He knew the exact slant of the October sun that told him the first hard frost was coming in 3 days, no more, no less. He knew which trees in the woods were still sound and which ones had gone hollow and rotten at the heart. And he taught me all of it, not with lessons, not with tests written out on paper. He taught me the way the old farmers taught, by doing the thing himself, right there beside you, until you could do it too. Then by standing back and watching while you did it. And then finally, by trusting you to do it right when he wasn't watching at all. By the time I was 12 years old, I could drive that old tractor down a row, straight as a string. By 14, I could take a soil sample and read what it was telling me. By 16, I was the one getting up at 4:30 in the black cold of the morning to do the early chores. Because Pop Silas's knees had started to give out on him by then, and somebody had to do it, and I was the somebody who was there. I want to say this part clearly because it matters to everything that comes after. I never once felt cheated by that work. Not one single day. I never felt trapped on that farm. I never felt like I was being used up. I felt needed. I felt, for the first time in my whole short life, like I was standing exactly where I was supposed to be standing. Do you know that feeling where you finally land somewhere and something in your chest goes quiet and you think, oh, this is the place? That's what those years were for me. Now, the rest of the family came around for the holidays, sometimes in the summer. Pop Silas had 2 sons. The older one was Royce. Royce lived all the way out in Denver. He sold insurance for a living. He drove a brand new truck every couple of years, and he spent most of every visit out on the front porch, pacing back and forth with his phone pressed up against his ear, making deals. The younger one was Wendell. Wendell lived up in Columbus, Ohio. He ran a heating and cooling business. He had soft pink hands for a man who claimed to make his living working with them. Between the two of them, there were a handful of grandchildren, real grandchildren, and those grandchildren had a great many opinions about that, farm opinions they handed out freely over every holiday dinner without ever once knowing a single true thing about the soil underneath their own feet. I was not one of them. Not in their eyes, anyway. I was Della's boy, Della who had embarrassed the family, Della who had made all those bad choices, Della who was gone now, and good riddance to all the trouble she dragged in behind her. To them, I was a complication, an obligation the old man had taken on out of some stubbornness they didn't understand. I heard Royce say it out loud one time at the Thanksgiving table. He thought I'd gone on out to the barn to check the heat lamps. Dad always did have a soft spot for strays, he said. And the table laughed. Just a little, just enough. I was 14 years old. I carried that one word around with me for a long, long time after that. Stray. It's a small word, but it can sit on a person's shoulders for years if you let it. But here is the thing. Pop Silas never once used that word. Not ever. Pop Silas never made me feel like a charity case, or a burden, or a problem that had to be managed and dealt with. He made me feel like that farm was as much mine as it was anybody's. More mine, maybe, because I was the one who was actually there working it, loving it, day in and day out. In the evenings when the chores were done, he'd walk the fence line with me, the light going gold and slow and easy across the ridge. And he would talk about that land the way that other men talk about their own family, with affection, with history in his voice, with a kind of deep belonging that didn't seem to have any end to it. One evening I was about 15. By then we stopped at the bend in the creek where the water turned and slowed. He pointed down at a flat gray stone, half sunk into the muddy bank. "Your great-grandmother did the wash right there," he said. "Used that very stone for a scrub board. 60 years back now." He was quiet for a moment, just looking at the water. "The land holds things, son," he said. "It holds them a whole lot longer than people do." I believed him when he said it. I'll tell you the truth. I still believe it now. Let me stop right here for just a moment before I go on. I've been telling you about a man who took in a boy nobody else wanted and never made him feel like anything less than family. I want to ask you something, and I'd truly love to hear your answer down in the comments. Was there ever someone like that in your life, someone who took you in or held on to you when they didn't have to? A grandmother, an aunt, a neighbor, anyone at all? Tell me about them. Say their name down below if you would. Let's remember those good people together tonight. And if you know already, deep in your heart, what it means to be loved quietly like that, go on and hit that subscribe button and stay right here with me, because I promise you this story is only just getting started. Now, let me tell you about the year everything began to change. When I was 16, Pop Silas started having what the doctor in town called his little episodes. Small strokes, nothing big and dramatic, but they added up over time the way little things do. He got slower, he got quieter, he got forgetful in certain ways. He'd leave the kettle on or call the heifer by the name of a cow that had died 10 years back. But here is the strange thing. In other ways, he got sharper, more deliberate, like a man who knows in his bones that his time is running short and has decided to spend every last bit of it on purpose. That was the year he started making trips into town that he never once explained to me. He'd drive off in the old truck on a Tuesday morning, dressed in his good shirt, the one he wore to church and funerals. And he'd come back in the afternoon with the manila envelope laid flat on the seat beside him. And then he'd take that envelope up to his bedroom and he'd lock it away inside an old gray strong box he kept hidden under a loose board in the floor. It was the same box where he kept the deeds to the land and the old tax records and a photograph of my grandmother that he never once put away in a drawer, not even after 20 years of being a widower. I noticed the trips. I noticed the envelopes. I didn't ask him a single question about any of it. I'd learned from living with that man that some things show themselves in their own time, and that a person who pushes won't ever learn half as much as a person who waits. So I waited. He died in February, the winter. I was 17 years old, a bad stroke in the night. By the time I heard him fall and got up and got to his room, he was already gone. He was gone before the ambulance even made it up, our long gravel drive. The funeral was held on a Tuesday. Royce flew in from Denver. Wendell drove down from Columbus. The cousins came. The neighbors came. All of them from miles around. Men from the county extension office came and stood out in the frozen field behind the house with their hats held over their hearts and said true things about him. People in that town respected Silas Crane in a way that his own two sons never once fully understood. I stood off at the edge of all of it, 17 years old, the cold coming up through the soles of my boots, and I understood that the ground underneath my feet had just shifted permanent and complete. I was right about that part. I just had no earthly idea yet how completely. The will was read 3 days after we put him in the ground. At the kitchen table, Royce sat at one end of it, Wendell sat at the other. Their wives took the chairs along the sides. And the family lawyer, a careful gray-haired man named Marcus Whitfield, who had handled Pop Silas's affairs for 30 years, he sat at the head of the table with a manila folder in front of him and the face of a man who already knew exactly how this was all going to land. I sat in the corner over by the wood stove. Nobody asked me to sit there. I just didn't have anywhere else to be. And I was cold in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with the February weather outside. I did not expect to be in that will. I want to be honest with you about that. I had no last name that tied me to anything in that room. My name was Hale, my father's name, a man I never met and never would. I was not Silas Crane's grandson, not on paper, not in any way the law would recognize. I was just Della's boy. I was a stray. Marcus Whitfield read it all out in that flat, careful, professional voice of his. The house and the 2 acres of yard around it went to Royce and Wendell to sell or to split as the two of them saw fit. The cattle went to Royce, already half sold off to a neighbor before the old man was even cold. The equipment went to Wendell, the tractor, the hay baler, the old feed wagon. a small sum of money split up between the real grandchildren as gifts toward their schooling. And then Marcus Whitfield paused. He looked up at me just for a second. Then he looked back down at the page in his hands. And to the minor child currently residing on the property, he read, I leave the sum of $250 and the request that my son see to his appropriate placement. The room went quiet for a moment. Then Royce's wife said in a bright and cheerful little voice, well, that was generous of him. I didn't say one word. I looked down at my own two hands, folded there in my lap, and I breathed. Slow in, slow out. The exact way that Pop Silas had taught me to breathe when the work got hard and your body wanted to quit on you. Appropriate placement, Wendell said. He turned the words over slowly like they had a taste he didn't much care for. I suppose that means the county home. Marcus Whitfield said nothing at all. Wendell turned in his chair and he looked at me. You understand how this works, son, he said. There's nothing holding you here now. The house is going up for sale. We'll call social services first thing in the morning. Get it all sorted out, proper and legal. I looked back at him and I thought about everything in the world that I could have said. I thought about telling him I'd put in 4 years on that ground, 4 years of mornings that started before the sun, 4 years of soil and sweat and the kind of hard work that does not stop for grief or for weather or for 17-year-old boys who are quietly breaking apart on the inside. I thought about telling him that I knew every single inch of those 70 acres better than both of his soft-handed sons put together, that I knew where the water pulled in the spring, that I could stand there and recite the yield history of every field on that farm from memory. I thought about all of it, and then I looked at that kitchen table, the same table where Pop Silas and I had eaten our breakfast together every single morning, 365 days a year, for years. And I felt something close up inside my chest. Quiet and final, like a heavy door swinging shut. I understand, I said, and I did. I just didn't understand everything, not yet. The children's home over in Broward County smelled like industrial floor cleaner and cafeteria, food, and a very particular kind of sadness that seems to live down in the cushions of institutional furniture. I arrived there in February with a garbage bag of clothes, a folder of school records, and $250 sitting in a bank account that had somebody else's name on it until the day I turned 18. I turned 18 13 months later, the following March. The morning they aged me out, a caseworker sat across from me at a gray metal table and told me in a kind and very practiced voice that there were resources available to me, that the transition was difficult for a lot of young people in my situation, that I should be sure to reach out if I needed any help. She handed me a manila envelope with $60 folded up inside it and a printed list of phone numbers, shelters, food banks, job training programs. I thanked her for it. And then I walked out the front door into a March morning that was cold and bright and completely, perfectly indifferent to whether I lived or died. And I got on a bus. You had a plan, not a big plan, not a plan with any guarantees attached to it. Just the next 3 steps, the way Pop Silas always said to do a hard job. One thing at a time. Step 1, find work. Step 2, find a room. Step 3, survive until the next thing got clear. For 2 years, that was the whole of my life. Those 3 steps, over and over. I found work at a feed store 2 counties over from anyone who knew my name, loading 50-pound sacks of grain and seed onto the backs of pickup trucks, hour after hour, until my back screamed and the skin on my knuckles cracked open and bled in the cold. That first winter, I rented a single room above that feed store, one window looking out at a gravel lot, a radiator that worked when it felt like working and sulked when it didn't. At night, I could hear the mice moving around inside the walls. And up through the floorboards came the smell of grain and dust and machine oil all day and all night long. I want you to understand something about that winter, because it's important to everything that comes after. There were nights I sat on the edge of that narrow little bed with my coat still on because the radiator had quit, and I counted out all my money on top of the blanket. A few crumpled bills, a small handful of coins, and I'd do the arithmetic in my head on how many days I could keep eating if I lost that job at the feed store. The answer was never very many days, never enough days to feel safe. And there was one night deep in January, the wind coming in around that bad window like it had a personal grudge against me when I sat there and I thought about giving up. I won't pretend to you that I didn't. I'd be lying if I said it. I sat on that bed, too tired to even take my boots off, and I thought to myself, nobody in this whole wide world knows where I am right now. Not one single soul. If I just stopped, if I just quit trying, there's not a person alive who would even notice I was gone. That's a dark place for a young person to be. I know some of you listening have been in a place like that too. And I want you to know I see you if you have. And then there came a knock on my door. It was the old man who ran the feed store down below. His name was Eli Boggs, a big, heavy-set fellow with a face full of white whiskers and two hands like a pair of catcher's mitts. He didn't say much of anything. He just stood there in my doorway and held out a plate covered over with tin foil. I could smell it through the foil. Pot roast and potatoes and carrots. Still warm. Wife made too much, he said. It was a lie. And I knew it was a lie, even as he said it, because Eli Boggs' wife had passed on 2 winters before. He'd told me so himself, one afternoon down in the store, his voice going rough on the words. But I took that plate from his hands anyway, and he looked at me for just a second longer than he needed to. My old daddy used to say, a man can stand just about anything in this life, he told me, long as he's got somewhere to put his feet down in the morning. And then he turned and went back down the stairs and left me standing there holding that warm plate. I sat down on the floor next to the radiator, and I ate every last bite of that pot roast. And I cried a little while I did it, where nobody could see, and I did not give up that night. I have thought about Eli Boggs and that one plate of pot roast more times than I could ever count in the years since, about how one small kindness given to a person at exactly the right moment can hold a whole entire life together right at the seam where it was about to come apart. If somebody ever did that for you, handed you a kindness right when you needed it most, I hope you're thinking about them right now. I moved on when the spring came, a hardware store in a bigger town up the road, then a diner, after that, where I bussed tables and learned to make a passable cup of coffee. And then, finally, a little apartment that I shared with 2 other folks who worked over at the regional hospital. I saved my money. Not much of it, but some. A little bit set by here and there. Enough to know deep down that I was at least moving in some kind of direction, even if that direction didn't have a name on it yet. I did not go back to the Crane farm, not once. I told myself I had no reason to, but I drove past it one time. The summer I was 19, there was a realtor's sign stuck in the ground at the end of the long gravel driveway, SOLD. It said, on a little banner stuck across the top. I felt something tighten up inside my chest, something I didn't have a good word for. I didn't slow the truck down. I just kept on driving and watched it shrink in my mirror. I heard about it later through the men down at the feed store, the way you hear about everything in a small place. The farm had sold to a couple from over the line in West Virginia. The Brennans, their name was, they bought it for a weekend place, someplace to come and play at country living on the nice Saturdays. The fields were going to seed, the men said. The cattle were long gone. Nobody was working that ground at all anymore. I told myself that land is just land. I told myself that what really matters in this life is the life you build for yourself, not the patch of ground you happen to stand on. I'm not sure I believed it. Even back then, the letter came on a Wednesday in October, the fall that I was 20 years old. It came to my apartment, the shared one, with the two hospital workers, which meant that somebody had gone to a real amount of trouble to track me down. Because I had moved 4 separate times in those 2 years, and I hadn't left a forwarding address anywhere worth speaking of. The return address in the corner was a law office, Whitfield and Associates, Cedar Hollow, Kentucky. The very same Marcus Whitfield who had read out the will at that kitchen table 3 years before. I sat down on the edge of my bed, and I held that envelope in my hands for a long, long while before I ever worked up the nerve to open it. Both my roommates were off at work. The whole apartment was quiet. Outside the window, the October light was doing exactly what October light does in that part of the country, going amber and slant and low, making every ordinary thing it touched look more important than it probably was. I opened it. The letter inside was just 4 short paragraphs. I read it through once, fast, and it didn't make a bit of sense to me. So I read it again, slow this time. Dear Mr. Crane, it began, and I stopped right there, right on those first 2 words. Mr. Crane, not Hale, not the name on my birth certificate, not the name I'd answered to my whole entire life. His name, in a letter that was addressed to me. I read on, and my heart was doing something strange and hard inside my chest. He represented the estate of Silas Crane, the letter said. He had served as the man's attorney for some 30 years, and in all that time, he had been instructed by Mr. Crane to make contact with me when I reached the age of 20 or just as soon as he was able to locate me, whichever one of those came later. Mr. Crane, the letter said, had signed certain legal documents in the final 18 months of his life. Documents that were not read out at that table on the day of the will. Documents that were not, in actual fact, any part of the will at all. They had been filed away with the county. They were a matter of public record, free for anyone to find. They had simply, the letter said, never once been brought to the attention of anyone else in the family. And Mr. Crane had left very specific instructions that all of this be told to me directly and privately. The last few lines of that letter I have never once forgotten, not to this day. I'll be plain with you, son. What your grandfather set aside in your name is significant, and you should have proper counsel beside you before you take a single step. I have been searching for you for 2 years now. I am very glad to have finally found you. I sat there very still while the October light moved slow across the floorboards of that little room, and I thought about an old man, making quiet, unexplained trips into town in the last years of his life, coming home with manila envelopes laid flat on the seat of his truck, locking them away in a gray strongbox under a loose board in the floor. And I thought about what he'd said to me that evening down by the bend in the creek. The land holds things, son. It holds them a whole lot longer than people do. My hands were not steady at all when I reached for the telephone. Let me pause again here, just for a breath. Lord knows I needed one, sitting on that bed. I want you to think back over your own life for a second. Has there ever been a moment, a letter, a phone call, a few words from somebody that split your whole life cleanly in two, a before and an after? That letter was mine, right there in that quiet little room, with the October light coming through the window. For 2 whole years, I had believed that I'd been forgotten, that I was, after all, exactly the thing they'd always said I was, a stray, somebody nobody had ever really wanted. If you've ever felt forgotten by the very people who were supposed to hold on to you, I want you to go down to the comments and leave me just one single word. One word. The name of somebody who never once let go of you, no matter what. Because we are going to need to hold on to that feeling for everything that comes next. Now, let me take you back to Cedar Hollow. I rode the bus back into Bryan County on a gray morning at the tail end of October. Cedar Hollow is the kind of little town you would drive right through and miss if you happened to blink at the wrong moment. One single stoplight, swinging on a wire over the main intersection, a diner with red vinyl booths and a hand-lettered pie menu in the window, a Methodist church with a white steeple that badly needed a fresh coat of paint, a feed store, a hardware store, and a main street that had not changed in any real way in 50 years. Marcus Whitfield's office sat on the second floor of a brick building that had been standing there since before either one of us was born. The wooden stairs creaked under my boots on the way up. The waiting room had dark wood paneling on the walls and a woman behind the front desk. Her name was Opal, gray, hair pinned up, neat, sharp, kind eyes, a cardigan sweater, the soft blue color of a robin's egg. When I gave her my name, she looked up at me, and she went very still for just a moment. Something moved across her face, something that sat right in between recognition and grief. "He talked about you," she said to me. Soft and low, more than once he did. I didn't have the first idea what to do with that. "Thank you," was all I could manage to get out. Marcus Whitfield was a man in his 60s with the careful bearing of someone who has spent his whole long life in the company of important paper. He shook my hand. He gestured for me to sit down in the chair across from his desk, and then he looked at me for a long moment before he opened up the folder lying in front of him. "I want to start," he said, "by telling you that what your grandfather did was completely legal, properly executed every step of the way, and entirely unassailable." He folded his hands together on the desk. "I want you to hear that part first," he said, "because the details I'm about to tell you are going to make you wonder whether somebody can come along and take all of this away from you. And I need you to understand, going in, they cannot. He made sure of it." "All right," I said. It was about all I could say. "Silas Crane," Whitfield said, "was the most deliberate man I have ever known in my life. When that man decided to do a thing, he did it all the way through. And when he decided to protect something, he paused for a second, he protected it thoroughly. And then he opened the folder. And he told me in the spring, nearly 2 full years before he died, long before that will was ever read out at the kitchen table, Pop Silas had signed a deed of transfer for the farmland, not to his sons, not to a family trust, not to anybody who had ever once sat down at that holiday table and complained about the property. To me, not the whole farm, the house and the 2 acres of yard around it, those he had deliberately left to Royce and to Wendell, on purpose, as a way to head off an outright fight, a way to put something into his son's hands so that the larger thing, the real thing, wouldn't get challenged the very second it came to light. But the rest of it, the 68 acres, the bottomland, the pasture, the woods, the frontage all along the creek, every last bit of that had been transferred quietly, completely, into a trust set up in my name, to be opened on the day I turned 20 years old, or on the day that Marcus Whitfield finally managed to find me, whichever one of those came first. I sat there and I stared down at that deed on the desk in front of me. My name was on it. My name printed out, right there, on a legal description of that land in the flat and careful language of property law. I could not make myself speak. "There's more," Whitfield said, and then he told me the rest. In the final months of his life, Pop Silas had also gone and recorded one more thing, a mineral rights reservation, covering all 70 acres of the original farm, including the 2 acres that had gone to his sons, including the land that had since been sold off to the Brennans from over in West Virginia. He had filed it down at the county courthouse in December, just 3 months before he died. It was public record. It was right there for anyone with the wit to look for it. It had simply never once been pointed out to a single living soul. "Mineral rights," I said, slow, turning the words over. Whitfield nodded. "Coal," he said. "There's a seam of it that runs underneath the eastern portion of that property, and in the last couple of years, son, that seam has become commercially valuable. There's been activity all over this county, companies quietly buying up rights, aggressively in some cases." He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward me. "Your grandfather knew that seam was down there," he said. Long before any of those companies ever did, he paid for a private geological survey out of his own pocket. Back in 1989, I would have been a baby. My mother would still have been a girl living on that farm. He sat on that information for 30 years, Whitfield said. He kept paying the taxes on that reservation year after year. He kept it current and clean and legal, and he waited. He looked up at me. He knew it was going to matter one day, he said. He just wanted to be certain that when that day finally came, it was yours, all of it. The room was very, very quiet. I thought about an old man with rough hands and a quiet voice walking the fence line in the gold evening light, talking to me about a creek and a washstone and what the land holds on to. He knew the whole time. Every single time he walked that fence line with me, every single time he said those words by the creek, he already knew. How much, I asked. And then I almost wished I hadn't asked, because I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the answer to it. Marcus Whitfield looked at me, steady. I had a preliminary assessment done, he said. The mineral rights alone before any development, before a single lease is ever signed, are conservatively valued somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000. He let that number just sit there in the air between us, and the land itself, he went on quiet, the 68 acres. Given what comparable ground has sold for in this county lately, that adds another $120,000 to $160,000 on top. I did not cry in that office. I held myself very still. I breathed, slow in and slow out, and I looked down at the deed with my own name printed on it. What do I do now? I asked him, and Marcus Whitfield almost smiled. That, he said, is entirely up to you, son. I have to stop here for a moment because I need to ask you something while it's fresh. Picture yourself in that chair, 20 years old, $60 to your name not so long ago, mice in the walls of your rented room, and a kind old lawyer has just slid a piece of paper across his desk and told you that you are sitting on more than $500,000. What would that have felt like in your chest in that moment? I'll tell you what it felt like for me. It did not feel like winning anything. It felt like an old man reaching out across death to put his hand on my shoulder. And I could hardly stand up under the weight of it. If you've ever felt the love of someone who was already gone, felt it land on you, sudden and heavy, long after you thought it was lost, then you know. Tell me in the comments if you do. And stay with me, because the hardest part of this story is still coming. I did not call Royce or Wendell that day or the next day. I needed to understand the whole shape of this thing first. Marcus Whitfield gave me 2 more appointments. He walked me through the trust documents, line by line. He walked me through the mineral filing. He put me in touch with a mineral rights attorney over in the county seat and with an old land appraiser who'd been working Broward County for 20 years. It was the appraiser who took me out to walk the land. A cold afternoon in the first week of November, the frost still lying blue in the deep shadows of the ridge, even at noon. We walked the bottomland together, the pasture, the frontage along the creek, and that old man talked about the coal seam, the way some men talk about a woman they loved a long time ago and never got over, with a patient kind of wonder in his voice. The seam ran deep, he told me, but it was accessible. There was good road access to be had. 3 different companies, he said, had already come sniffing around the county about the rights nearby. The timing of all this, he said, looking out across the ridge with his hands in his coat pockets, is not any kind of accident. Your grandpa saw this coming. Years out, he saw it. He shook his old head slowly. Smartest man I believe I ever met. He was the smartest man I ever knew, I said. And then I made myself drive past the house. I had to. I pulled the truck up to the end of that long gravel driveway in the spot where the realtor's sign used to stand. The Brennans had fixed it up nice, new shutters, painted a deep green, a porch swing hanging by the front door, a little flower garden out front, gone brown now for the winter. But the fields beyond the house, my fields, they were gone to weeds and brush and scrubby little cedar trees. Nobody had worked that ground in 3 years. You could see it just dying out there, going back to wild. I sat in that truck and I looked at it for a long, long while. That evening, I ate my supper alone in a booth at the diner on Main Street. There was an old woman in the next booth over white hair, a quilted coat she hadn't taken off, And she kept on looking at me, glancing over, then looking away, then glancing back. Finally, she leaned across the gap between the booths. "You're Silas Crane's boy," she said. It wasn't a question. She said it like a settled fact. I didn't correct her. He pulled my husband's truck out of a ditch one time in an ice storm, must be 20 years back now. She studied my face openly, the way old women in small towns wouldn't take one thin dime for it either. Just tipped his hat and drove on home. She nodded slowly to herself. "You've got his way of sitting still, you know that?" And then she gathered up her pocketbook and she paid for my cup of coffee on her way out the door. I never even got her name. I sat in that booth for a long while after she'd gone, the coffee going cold in front of me. For 3 whole years, I had believed that town had just let me vanish, that I'd walked out of it with a garbage bag, and nobody had so much as glanced back over their shoulder to wonder where I'd gone. And here was a perfect stranger, buying my coffee, telling me I had his way of sitting still. I want you to hold on to that, because I had to fight to keep it in the days that came next. Because 3 days after that, a man named Garrett Voss walked into Marcus Whitfield's office and asked to have a word with me. Voss worked for a company called Meridian Resources. He wore a gray suit that I'd have bet cost more than I'd made in 3 months of breaking my back at the feed store. He had a soft handshake and a hard white smile and a pair of eyes that did all of their real work while his mouth was busy saying something pleasant. He sat down across from me and he slid a folder over the desk. "Mr. Crane," he said, "I'll cut right to the chase here. We would like to acquire your mineral rights. A clean offer, no fuss, no muss. You walk away a wealthy young man and you never have to give any of it another thought for the rest of your life." I opened the folder. The number printed inside it was $85,000. I looked back up at him. Beside me, Marcus Whitfield had gone very, very still in his chair. "My understanding," I said, slow, "is that these rights are worth a good deal more than that." Voss's smile did not move so much as a hair. "Valuations are funny things, son," he said. "A thing's only ever worth what somebody is willing to pay you for it, on the day. And here's the part you really ought to know." He leaned forward, lowered his voice, like he was doing me a great personal favor. "Your uncles have already been in touch with us, and they are not happy at all. They are talking right now about contesting this whole arrangement, about taking it to court, claiming the old man wasn't right in the head when he signed it all over to you." He let that hang there in the air a moment. "Court costs money, son. Court takes years out of a man's life. A young fella like you just barely getting on his own 2 feet, why, you could be tied up in litigation until you're 30 years old. Or," he reached out and tapped that folder with one finger, "you take a clean, certain offer right here today, and it's done. Over. Everybody goes home happy." He stood up. He buttoned his fine gray jacket. "We'll need to hear your answer inside of 90 days, he said. "The window on this particular seam doesn't stay open forever. After that, this offer comes right off the table and you're on your own, against your own family, and against a whole lot of expensive lawyers." He left, and I sat there in that chair feeling the floor tilt underneath me, the very same way it had tilted at that kitchen table 3 years before. I'm going to stop us right here because I have to ask you, if you were the one sitting in that chair, 20 years old, nothing much to your name, and a smiling man in an expensive suit is telling you to just take the certain money and walk away clean, what would you have done? Would you have taken that $85,000 and never once looked back? Or would you have stood your ground and fought for what an old man had spent 30 quiet years protecting just for you? Tell me down in the comments. I truly do want to know what's in your heart. And while you're down there, go on and subscribe and stay right here with me. Because what happened next, I could never in 100 years have planned it out myself. Now, let me tell you how I answered Garrett Voss. I told him no, but I didn't tell him that day. I made him wait on it. I went home, back to that little apartment, and I lay awake most of that whole night long staring up at the ceiling. $85,000. I had never once in my entire life held more than a few $100s at a single time. $85,000 was a roof over my head, a truck that started every morning, a whole life with no fear sitting down at the foot of the bed. And it would have been so easy, so simple, just sign the paper and let it all go and never have to fight my own family in a courtroom. But I kept hearing his voice all night long, Pop Silas. When he decided to protect something, he protected it thoroughly. 30 years. A geological survey paid for out of his own thin pockets back in 1989. Taxes kept current year after year on a thing that nobody else on this earth even knew existed. Every bit of it pointing straight at one quiet, stubborn, unmovable fact. He had not done all of that so that I could turn around and hand it over to a man in a gray suit for pennies on the dollar. He had done all of that so that I would stay. In the morning, I called Marcus Whitfield, and I told him I was going to fight. He was quiet on the line for just a second, and then he said, "Good, then let's you and me get to work." The first thing we did was go back to the survey. Whitfield still had the original 1,989 document right there in his files. Stiff, yellowed paper, folded up in thirds, soft at the creases from age. And there in the margins, in pencil, were Pop Silas's own careful notes. His handwriting, little numbers and arrows that only he had ever fully understood. I ran my thumb over that pencil, the man's own hand. I had to set it down for a minute. We needed to prove two things, the mineral attorney explained to me. First, that the reservation had been properly filed before the Brennans had ever bought the surface land, which would mean they had purchased the surface of that farm without the coal that lay underneath it. And second, that Silas Crane had been completely sound of mind on the day he signed it all over to me. The first part was easy. The filing date was right there, stamped in the county clerk's office, December, a good while before that sale ever closed. The second part, that was where Voss and my two uncles were going to make their whole stand, that the old man had been confused, manipulated, not himself. And here is the thing about Pop Silas that not one of them ever understood in their whole lives. He had been 3 steps out ahead of them the entire time. Marcus Whitfield reached into his cabinet and he pulled out another folder. This one was thicker than the first. Inside it was a signed statement from Pop Silas's own doctor, dated the very same week he'd signed the trust, a clean, clear bill of mental health, lucid, competent, of sound mind and clear memory, the doctor had written, in full possession of his faculties. And underneath that doctor's letter affidavits, 2 of them, sworn statements from witnesses who had been right there in the room on the day he signed every page, the notary public, and Opal, who had typed up every single document with her own 2 hands. He told me to keep these separate from everything else, Whitfield said. His voice had gone quiet and rough. He sat right where you're sitting now. And he said to me, and I'm quoting the man exactly, he said, "Marcus, my boys are going to stand up and say I lost my mind at the end. I want it proved in writing that I did not." He looked at me across the desk. He knew, Whitfield said. 3 years ago he knew. He knew exactly how every bit of this was going to go, before you ever even knew there was anything coming. I held those papers in my 2 hands, and something happened to me sitting there in that office. Something I have a hard time even putting into words for you. For 3 whole years, I had carried that one word around with me, stray. I had let it settle down onto my shoulders like a soaked-through winter coat that I could never quite get dry. And somewhere in there, in the cold and the loneliness, I had started to half believe it myself. And now I was holding the proof right there in my own hands. Proof written into an old man's careful, stubborn planning that he had never, not for one single second of his life, seen me that way. He had seen a fight coming, a fight coming straight for me years down the road, and he had quietly filled up my pockets with every single thing I would ever need to win it, long, long before I even knew there was going to be a war. But there was one more thing waiting for me in that office. The strong box, Marcus Whitfield had recovered it from the house. He told me before the sale ever went through. It had been sitting in the safe in his office for 3 years, just waiting. The way everything else had been waiting. He set it down on the desk in front of me. Old gray metal, scuffed at the corners, a small brass lock. It was the very same box I had watched Pop Silas slide those manila envelopes into all those years ago, under the loose board in his bedroom floor. When he thought that I wasn't watching, he left you the key to it, Whitfield said. And he reached into his drawer and he handed me a small brass key hanging on a little loop of baling twine. My hands were shaking. I'm not ashamed to tell you that. I want you to understand something. In all the years I lived in that house, I never once opened that box. I never even touched it. It was his. It was private. And I had learned from the man himself to let things reveal themselves in their own good time. Now it was mine, and the time was right now. I fit that little brass key into the lock, and I turned it. The lid came up with a small, dry creak of the old hinge. On the very top were the papers, the original deeds, the old tax records, all the dry and important paper of one man's whole long life lived out on the land. I lifted those out and set them aside. And underneath was a photograph of my grandmother, the very same one he'd kept standing up on his dresser all those years. A woman I'd never met, with kind eyes and her hair done up in an old-fashioned way. I set that aside too, gentle. And underneath that, there was a smaller photograph, faded almost white, curled up at all four corners with age. It was me. It was me at maybe 5 years old, long before I ever came to live on that farm. I was sitting on my mother's lap in a little kitchen I didn't recognize, with yellow curtains in the window behind us. And my mother, Della, she had her head thrown back and she was laughing at something just off the edge of the picture. She looked young. She looked whole. She looked happy in a way I had absolutely no memory of ever once seeing on her face in real life. I had never in my life owned a single photograph of my mother. Not one, not a single picture of her face to look at when I tried to remember her. And I sat there in that quiet office and I looked down at her laughing with her little boy on her lap, and my throat closed up so tight and so sudden that I could not pull in a breath. But there was more. Down at the bottom of that box, a bundle of envelopes, maybe 20 of them, all together. Tied up with that same rough baling twine, they were addressed in Pop Silas's own hand, that careful, blocky writing, addressed to my mother, to Della, at addresses all over the state, addresses I didn't know, addresses she must have lived at. I realized in all those years she was gone from the farm, and every single one of those envelopes had a stamp across the front of it, in red ink, return to sender, address unknown. He had written to her over and over and over again for years and years. He had tried to find her. He had tried to bring his girl back home. And every single letter he ever sent had come back to him unopened, undelivered, with that cold red stamp slapped across the front of it. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely manage it. But I opened one. I know I maybe shouldn't have, but I had to. It was short, just a few lines in pencil. He told her the South Field had come in good that year. He told her the door was always open to her, always. He told her she could come home any time at all and bring the boy. Bring the boy. He'd known about me. He had known about me, and he had wanted me years and years before I ever stood in that gravel driveway in my socks and watched the ambulance pull away. He had wanted me the whole time. I put my head down on the edge of Marcus Whitfield's desk, and for the first time since I was a very small child, I wept. I wept like something inside me had finally broken open after being held shut for 20 years. I wept for my mother, Della, who never got to read a single one of those letters, who spent all those years out there somewhere alone, believing that nobody in the world wanted her back home. I wept for the boy in that faded photograph, sitting on her lap, who didn't know yet what was barreling down the road toward him. And I wept for the old man, the quiet, stubborn, rough-handed old man who wrote letters out into the dark year after year after year, who got every last one of them back, stamped in red, and who never once stopped trying, who never said one single word about any of it. Not to me, not to anyone, who just set a place at the table. Marcus Whitfield did not say a thing. He didn't try to. He just sat there with me, and he let me cry, and he handed me his handkerchief when I needed it. The same way Eli Boggs had once sat with me with a warm plate of pot roast, the way that decent people will sit with you when there are simply no words in the world for the thing that's in the room. After a long while, I sat up, and I wiped my face with his handkerchief. And I knew, all the way down to the soles of my feet, I knew I was not going to let Garrett Voss or anybody else have one single acre of that land. Let me catch my breath here. I think I need to. I expect maybe you do too. If those letters got to you the way they got to me, if you know in your own heart what it is to find out too late just exactly how much you were loved all along, then you understand sometimes the people who loved us the most just couldn't reach us. The letter came back. The phone went unanswered. The years got in between. But I have come to believe with my whole heart that it does not mean they didn't try. If there's somebody you've been thinking about all through this story, somebody who maybe tried harder than you ever knew, I hope you'll say their name in the comments tonight. Let's hold them in the light together. Stay with me. We are almost to the part where it all comes due. I asked Marcus Whitfield to set up a meeting, not a fight, not a courtroom, a meeting, Royce and Wendell, their wives, their lawyer, a Sharp City fellow named Patterson, who came down all the way from Cincinnati, the Brennan's attorney, because I had insisted on it. They needed to understand the ground they were standing on, those Brennans, and I wanted them to hear it straight from the professionals, not as a rumor over pie down at the diner, and Garrett Voss from Meridian. It happened on a Saturday in December in Marcus Whitfield's conference room up on that second floor, the light coming in low and gray and weak through the old windows, snow spitting against the glass. I'll tell you exactly what I expected walking into that room. I expected anger. I expected to be talked right over, dismissed, treated like the stray they had all always believed I was. What I did not expect was how quiet that whole room would get. Marcus Whitfield laid it all out, one single document at a time, slow and careful, no drama in his voice at all. He didn't need any. The deed of transfer, dated nearly 2 full years before Silas Crane ever died. The mineral reservation, filed down at the courthouse before the Brennans ever put pen to paper. The 1,989 survey, with the old man's pencil notes still in the margins. The doctor's signed statement, the 2 sworn affidavits, the whole careful architecture of a man who had seen this exact day coming 3 years before it ever arrived. Patterson, the Sharp City lawyer, asked his questions, and Whitfield answered every single one of them, calm and patient, like a man who had known the questions were coming before they were ever asked. Because I watched the fight go right out of Patterson. Somewhere around the 3rd document, I watched. Then he leaned over and he said something low into Royce's ear. And I watched Royce's face change. Voss tried near the end, I'll give him that. He started up about the seam and about his offer and about how reasonable a clean exit would be for everybody concerned, all things considered. And Patterson, his own side's hired man, the lawyer my uncles were paying, Patterson cut him right off. "There is no case here," Patterson said. "Flat. Final. These documents are airtight. Contesting this would cost a fortune, it would take years, and it would lose. I will not advise my clients to pursue it." The whole room went still. Garrett Voss buttoned up his fine gray jacket. He stood, and he looked over at me. And for just one single second, that pleasant mask of his slipped right off his face. And I saw exactly what was underneath it. "You're making a mistake here, son," he said. "Maybe so," I said back to him. "But it's mine to make." He left, and the door clicked shut behind him, and that was the last that I ever saw of Garrett Voss in my life. The silence that came after the door shut was a different kind of silence. Wendell was looking down at his own hands, flat on the table. He didn't say anything for a long, long while. And then he said, without ever looking up at me, "He never told us." "No," I said, "he didn't. He could have. He could have just said something, just told us, straight out. He could have." I agreed. Wendell kept looking down at the table. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had changed. There was something underneath it now that had not been there before. "We were never coming back," he said. "Not really. We both knew it, Royce and me both. We left this place, and we made our lives out there. And every time we came back here, it was duty. That's all it was. It was never love. Not for a long time." He stopped, and he knew that, Wendell said. He knew it about us for a long, long time. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. And then Wendell looked up, right at me. For the first time, maybe ever, really looking. "And you stayed," he said. He didn't say it like an accusation. He said it like something else entirely, like a fact. A simple fact, spoken out loud at last, that had been true in that family for years and years, and nobody had ever once said it. I said, "Royce was looking at me too now. And for the very first time in my whole life, I noticed something. He had his father's eyes, the same gray as Pop Silas. I had either never seen it before, or I had never let myself see it." "You worked that land," Royce said to me. "For years," I said. He nodded, slow. He wasn't making an excuse for himself. He was just letting the fact of it sit there in the gray December light of that conference room. "What do you want?" he asked me, finally, from us. I had thought about that exact question for weeks. I had turned it over and over, alone in the evenings, asking myself what Pop Silas would have wanted me to say in this very room. "I don't want anything from you," I said. "The land is mine. The law says it's mine." He said it was mine 30 years ago when he paid for that survey out of his own pocket and never told a living soul. I looked at the two of them, Royce and Wendell. "What I want," I said, "is for this to end clean. No courts, no more lawyers past what we need to finish out the paperwork, no dragging this thing through 5 years of county gossip and bad blood." I let that settle a second. "He's buried out on the edge of that property," I said, "in the family plot. Next to your mother. I'd like to be able to go and tend his grave without it being a battlefield every time I do." I let it sit. "That's all I want," I said. "That's the whole of it." The room was quiet for a long, long time. Outside, somewhere down on Main Street, somebody started up a truck engine in the cold. The sound carried up through the old brick walls of that building. "Send the paperwork," Royce said. "At last. Our lawyer will sign off on it." And they did. "I want to ask you to do something for me right here, before we go on to how it all ends." In that conference room, I had every right in the world to take everything to make them hurt the way they'd hurt me, to win the whole way and grind it in. And I didn't. I asked for the right to tend an old man's grave in peace. Was that the right thing to do, or should I have made them pay for those years? I've wondered about it myself more than once. Tell me what you think down in the comments. I genuinely want to know how you'd have played it. Now, let me tell you where I am today. The legal end of all of it took about 3 months to finish out. The Brennans kept their house and their 2 acres. They had bought that surface in good faith, and I never had one bit of quarrel with them over it. We worked out a fair access agreement for the mineral rights. Their lawyer fussed about it some at the start, and then he accepted it. Because there wasn't really anything else for him to do but accept it. I did not sign with Meridian Resources, not with Garrett Voss, not with any of the aggressive ones, the ones who came at you smiling with a number that was a tenth of what a thing was worth. Months later, I signed a fair and honest lease with a smaller outfit, a reputable one. It was not the great fortune those first big numbers had hinted at, I'll tell you that. Mineral development is a slow business. The royalties come in over years and years, not all at once, in a single check, but the signing payment, that was enough. It was enough to settle all my debts, every last one, and enough to put a little money back into the ground itself, which is exactly to the penny what Pop Silas would have done with it. Wendell called me up in February, just about 2 weeks after every last piece of paper was finally signed. It was a short phone call. He said there was something he needed to say to me before it got any harder to say it. That day, he said, at the kitchen table, when they read the will, his voice was rough on the line. I said something about the county home, about you needing to be placed somewhere. He stopped, like you were a piece of furniture, something to be moved out of the way. He was quiet a second. You weren't, he said. You were a kid. You were ours. You were his. Another stop. I'm sorry for it. I've been sorry for a long while. It was not a long apology. It did not undo a single one of those years. It did not give me back the winter above the feed store, or the nights I spent counting coins out on a blanket, or the boy who sat alone on the floor by a radiator and cried into a plate of pot roast. But it was real. I could hear on the line that it had cost him something to say it. And the things that cost us something to say, those are the only things in this world that ever really mean anything at all. I know, I said to him, thank you for saying it, Wendell. And I meant it. I want to tell you where I live now and how it feels. I did not move back into the house. The Brennans own that, and the truth is, I never wanted it back. Too many ghosts in those rooms, and not all of them sad ones. What I did instead was put a small place of my own up on the high pasture, a little single wide, set right where it looks down over the whole creek bottom and the dark line of the woods beyond it. I have lived up there now through 3 full growing seasons. I put the first of the lease money straight into the south bottomland, planted it back in good hay, and I leased the cutting of it to a neighbor who runs cattle, a younger fellow, just getting started, the way I once was. And in the evenings when the work is done, I walk the fence line the very same way that Pop Silas and I used to walk it together, the light going gold and slow and easy across the ridge. Pop Silas is buried out at the edge of the East Woods in a little family plot that has been right there for 4 generations now. There's a stone for him and a stone for my grandmother beside him. And 2 small stones for 2 babies who didn't make it through their first winters long, long before my time. I go up there on Sunday mornings. I clear the fallen leaves off the stones in the autumn. I plant wildflowers along the edge of the little iron fence in the spring. And I talk to him, not in any way that asks you to believe anything in particular about what comes after this life. I don't know about all that. I just talk to him the way you talk to someone who shaped you, someone whose voice is still living somewhere up inside your head, someone whose way of doing things quietly became your own way of doing things without you ever even noticing it was happening to you. I tell him about the hay yield, about the February that came in too wet and the July that came in too dry, about the way the creek still goes amber in the slant October light, exactly the same way it always did when I was a boy. I tell him I understand now the trips into town, the manila envelopes, the locked up box, the 30 long years of waiting and watching and knowing and never once saying a word. I tell him he was right about all of it. The land does hold things. It holds them a whole lot longer than people do. There is one more thing I have to tell you before I let you go tonight. Last fall, I had cause to go down into the county archives. I was looking for an old plat map, trying to settle a question about a property line up along the ridge. And a young clerk back there brought out the county's own filed copy of that 1,989 survey. I was running my finger down the margin of it, checking the acreage figures against my own when I found it. A note, down in the corner, in Pop Silas's careful pencil hand, filed away in a county drawer in the dark for 30 whole years. just waiting there, waiting to be found. 5 words. That's all it was. For the one who stays. I stood there in that quiet archive room with that old, soft paper in my 2 hands, and I read those 5 words over and over. And I thought about a 7-year-old boy standing out in a gravel driveway in his socks, watching an ambulance pull away with his mother inside it, a boy that nobody seemed to want, a boy who would one day be told, flat out, at a kitchen table, that there was nothing in this world holding him anywhere. And I thought about a man, a quiet, stubborn man with rough hands, who looked at that boy and who did not call the county and did not make arrangements and did not explain his reasons to a single living soul. He just set a place at the table and he said, "Tomorrow, you learn to feed chickens." For the one who stays, I was always going to be that one. He saw it in me before I ever saw it in myself. He built the whole road out ahead of me while I was still just learning how to walk it. I drove home from those archives that afternoon, and the fields were greening up on the south slope. The creek was running clear and high with the last of the snowmelt, and a pair of red-tailed hawks were working the wind up above the ridge, lazy and patient, riding their slow, wide circles in the gold of the spring light. I stopped the truck at the top of the rise, and I got out, and I just stood there a while, in the wind. 68 acres, bottomland and pasture and woods, and the long frontage down along the creek, and a seam of coal running deep beneath every bit of it, patient as the man who'd found it, patient as the land its own self. Mine, not because I fought for it, though Lord knows I did, not because I was lucky or clever, or because I happened to be born to the right name. I wasn't born to it at all. Mine because an old man with rough hands and a quiet voice knew exactly what the law could do and exactly what the land could hold and exactly what a boy that everybody else had counted out still deserved to come into. I am the stray who stayed, and the land kept my name down in it all along. I had work to do that evening. The fence up on the north pasture needed checking, and the creek crossing needed a load of gravel hauled in before the heavy summer rains came on. So I got back into the truck, and I drove on down toward the bottom, toward the creek, toward the work that had always been mine, and now, at long last, completely and forever, toward the land that was mine too. Let me leave you with this, and then I'll let you go. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of it. I know it was not always an easy road to walk down. I think about my grandfather every single day of my life. And the one thing I keep coming back around to is this: family is not always the people whose blood you happen to share. Sometimes family is the one who sets a place at the table for you, the one who doesn't send you away when it would be easier to, the one who loves you so quietly and so completely that you don't even find out the true size of it until years and years after they're already gone. So I want to ask you one last thing before you go tonight. Has there ever been somebody in your life who chose to love you when they didn't have to? Somebody who saw you and kept you when nobody else in the world seemed to? Tell me about them down in the comments. Say their name out loud tonight. Let's remember those good people together, you and me. And if this story touched something down deep in you, if you know in your own bones what it is to be the one who stayed, then go on and subscribe and stay right here with me. Because there are more stories like this one coming. Stories about hope, about second chances, about finding your home in the very last place you ever thought to look for it. The fields are still here, the work goes on, and the land, as Pop Silas knew better than any man I ever met, holds on to things a whole lot longer than people do. I'll see you next time.